Hope you're all doing well. I am recording this kind of late at night. I don't know. I feel like time just doesn't. I don't know. It's like I don't know where it goes. Like I'm working all day, and then I'm like, oh, like I didn't record the lecture, and now it's 11. I'm sorry. But today we're talking about Audre Lorde, who like I love so much. So I'm sad that we can't read more of Zami. We just ran out of time, I guess, but you guys all have it, so like you can finish it. I love this book. I am not a big memoir person, but this is the first time I read this. I was really like moved, and yeah, I would highly recommend it to anyone who wants to finish it. And I would also like to point out to you that Audre Lorde is included in our anthology, part 2. So her work begins on page 1490. And that's where I want to start. So we have some really good presentations on Audre Lorde that you can refer to if you want to know more about her life, but I will give you a bit of an overview as well here. And the way the book writes about her in the beginning is like really well done, so I'm just going to read that to you. Audre Lorde's poetry wages what she called, quote, a war against the tyrannies of silence. It articulates what has been passed over out of fear or discomfort, what has been kept hidden and secret. Reading her, we feel the violence inherent in breaking a silence, perhaps most often as she probes the experience of anger. The anger of black toward white or white toward black, a woman's anger at men and other women, and men's anger toward women. My black woman's anger, she wrote in her collection of essays, Sister Outsider, is a molten pond at the core of me, my most fiercely guarded secret. Having admitted this secret into her poems, Lorde transforms our expectations of what is a fit subject for the lyric. Her work is often deliberately disturbing, the powerful voice of the poem cutting through denial, politeness, and fear. And so this theme of breaking silence is something that you will see in all of Lorde's work. She wrote an essay called The Transformation of Silence into, well, no, I can't remember it, language, I'm pretty sure. Transformation of silence into language, Lorde. Anyway, in this essay, she basically discusses the transformation of silence into language and action. Okay, so in this essay, she talks about how silence itself is like the most dangerous thing, and that to give language to something that we don't normally speak about, we are also inherently participating in a call to action. And so Lorde, for me personally, was really the first poet who showed me the ways in which poetry can be, I guess the ways in which poetry is always political and language is always political. And what I mean by that is, there are so many ways to talk about how language is political, but like the very fact that I'm speaking English to you right now has political roots, right? Like the way that we speak to one another is inherently political. The way that we decide what grammar is correct and what grammar isn't correct, like that comes from like a history of, who had power and who didn't, right? And so for me, Lorde really makes explicit that link between like language and power. And she, in her work, uses language to challenge existing structures of power and also to affirm her own power and the power of women like her. So Zami, as mentioned in our book, is a biomythography of her growing up and her emergent lesbian identity. And then they say, the urgency Lorde felt to make experience verbal and shared, however, sometimes overrode a distinction crucial to her work, that between poetry and rhetoric. She preserved this distinction in her best work by listening and responding to other voices in herself and in the world around her, which is interesting. Like, I don't know. I like all her work, but like, maybe not, I guess the Norton people need to like insult her in their description of her, which is, rude, but okay. So Lorde grew up and spent most of her life in New York. She grew up in Harlem and then moved to Washington Heights, as is mentioned in our early chapters of Zami. One second, I'll put my costume over here. Okay. So she spent her whole life pretty much in New York. In the 70s, she went to West Africa, where she spent a lot of time studying Yoruba culture, and basically like using that time to reclaim her African roots and heritage within her poetry. So in this book, The Black Unicorn, she deals a lot with like Yoruba mythology and uses that to kind of tell us like the story of herself as like a Black American woman, the child of West Indian immigrants. She died in 1992. She was not very old. She was 58, I believe, if I just did that math correctly. And she died of cancer that she probably got when she was working in a factory in the 50s, which was the only job really like available to her at the time as a Black woman. So Lorde really spent like her whole life railing against, what she saw as like the racism and like sexism and like misogyny and homophobia of America and American culture and American systems. And ultimately she kind of paid like the highest price that you possibly can for systemic racism, and that she like died because she had to take work in this factory, which, is still, true today for so many people who like don't have access to education or like whatever, like there are still people working in coal mines because like they don't have the access to like better resources or education, or because that's like all there is to do in that town. So we still, and even with like what we see today with like COVID-19 and like essential workers, right, like people who make the least money, who are working in like fast food restaurants and grocery stores, are being asked to risk the most, just to like do these like essential jobs, which are not paid like they're essential. Obviously doctors are like also risking their lives, but doctors make enough money. So Lorde's work was it was always political. And what I want to talk about with Zami today, I guess I just want to like point out some of the stuff that's going on in these like first 70 pages of this memoir. So I gave you guys some discussion questions that I think will help guide you, and I really do wish we like could have talked about this in class, because I feel like it's really a better book to approach with like questions than it is to approach with me just like lecturing as if I know everything, because I don't. This is just the unfortunate format that we're like stuck using right now. But yeah, so this tells us her story as a young woman growing up. What the book calls her emergent lesbianism, and also tells us the story of like her family, of what it meant to grow up as like the child of immigrants in Harlem at this time, and in New York more generally, because they moved out of Harlem when she was, I guess, in elementary school. And also tells us sort of the story of like how she became a poet. So I want to start with kind of her relationship to her mother and to language in this book. So she tells us on page 31, she gives us this chapter that's titled How I Became a Poet. and says, my mother had a special and secret relationship with words, taken for granted as language because it was always there. I did not speak until I was 4. And then she gives us some examples of the way her mother spoke on page 32. We were never dressed too lightly, but rather in next kin to nothing. Next kin to nothing? Impassable and impossible distances were measured by the distance from Hog to Kickham Jenny. Hog? Kickham Jenny? Who knew until I was sane and grown a poet with a mouthful of stars that these were 2 little reefs in the Grenadines, between Grenada and Carriacou. The euphemisms of body were equally puzzling, if no less colorful. A mild reprimand was accompanied not by a slap on the behind, but a smack on the back ass, or on the bamsy. You sat on your bam-bam, but anything between your hip bones and upper thighs was consigned to the lower region, a word I always imagined to have French origins, as in, don't forget to wash your l'origine before you go to bed. For more clinical and precise descriptions, there was always between your legs, whispered. And then a paragraph lower, she says, I never caught cold, but got cohum, and then everything turned croboso, topsy-turvy, or at least a bit askew. I am a reflection of my mother's secret poetry as well as her hidden angers. So she gives us this examination of the language that was there in her childhood, and it was the language of her mother's, patois slang from Grenada. I never know how to say that. And her experience with language as a child also involved her mother's use of patois with her father whenever they wanted to talk about something that they didn't want the kids to hear about. So on the one hand, she had this kind of altered understanding of language because it wasn't the language that all of these white kids who she went to school with were speaking, because she was the only black student in her school. And on the other hand, she was kind of excluded from her full cultural inheritance because her parents didn't teach her patois, and they used it as a language of things the kids can't understand. Her mother also was silent about racism. So there are a lot of examples of this in the book, but I want to turn to page 58. So Lorde begins chapter 8 with telling us, as a child, the most horrible condition I could contemplate was being wrong and being discovered. Mistakes could mean exposure, maybe even annihilation. In my mother's house, there was no room in which to make errors, no room to be wrong. No room to be wrong. And later on this page, she says, one day, my mother was out marketing, and my sisters were talking about someone being colored. In my 6-year-old way, I jumped at this chance to find out what it was all about. What does colored mean? I asked. To my amazement, neither one of my sisters was quite sure. Well, Phyllis said, the nuns are white, and the short-necked store man is white, and Father Mulvoy is white, and we're colored. And Mommy, is she white or colored? I don't know, answered Phyllis impatiently. Well, I said, if anybody asks me what I am, I'm going to tell them I'm white, same as Mommy. Oh, girl, you better not do that, they both chorused in horror. Why not? I asked, more confused than ever, but neither of them could tell me why. That was the first and only time my sisters and I discussed race as a reality in my house, or at any rate as it applied to ourselves. So, in their home, race is something that is really never spoken about, and so you see these young girls kind of trying to figure out what race was and what it meant in America, and especially what it meant for them. And their mother was really light-skinned and could pass for white, and their father was much darker-skinned, and Audre was darker-skinned than both of her sisters as well. And so they all had these kind of varying experiences of their own racial identities in New York at the time, based on how light-skinned they were. And her mother tries to shield her from these experiences of racism, but she does it without telling her like she essentially does it by denying racism as like a force that needs to be discussed at all. So on page 61, after Audre tells her mother like about the way the kids at school bully her because she's the only black girl, her mother says, "You don't need friends." She says, "What do you care what they say about you anyway?" Bottom of 60, top of 61. "Do they put bread on your plate? You go to school to learn, so learn and leave the rest alone. You don't need friends." I did not see her helplessness nor her pain. So she tries to shield her consistently from this racism that she like can't fix for her, you know. So as her mother, she feels really powerless. And Audre decides to run for this election, which of course she doesn't win because the students are racist and they are in charge of the voting. Even her teachers are racist, right? And they like don't help her when she's being bullied. So her experiences in school are all really pretty like not good, right? And her mother really hammers it home to her, like, you're there to learn, you're not there to make friends, and you don't need to follow these white kids around. So on page 65, after Audre has lost the election and her mother catches her crying and hits her a bunch, her mother says, "Child, why you worry your head so much over fair or not fair? Just do what is for you to do and let the rest take care of themselves." So, instilling this real individuality in her daughter to kind of make up for the fact that her daughter's not going to be able to find like a community in this school filled with white children. And that's a big theme of the rest of the book too, is just like Lorde's search for community, which she finds once she kind of like recognizes her identity as a lesbian, and sort of builds this really beautiful community with like other women who are also like writers. But as a child, she felt very isolated, right? Like her two sisters didn't want her to listen to their stories. She was the smartest kid in school, which is always, you know, you're going to be like lonely usually if you're the smartest kid in school, especially because she was like the only black kid, and it was in the 50s, maybe 40s. So the last thing I want to say about how her family dealt with racism is on page 69, and I think that she does a really good job like explaining it here. American racism was a new and crushing reality that my parents had to deal with every day of their lives once they came to this country. They handled it as a private woe. My mother and father believed that they could best protect their children from the realities of race in America and the fact of American racism by never giving them name, much less discussing their nature. We were told we must never trust white people, but why was never explained, nor the nature of their ill will. So, in contrast to her childhood experiences, Lorde will then spend the rest of her life as a writer giving voice to these sort of like silent places of American culture. And so, like, as I read in her bio in the book, she often wrote about like the experience of anger and like, which, you know, of course she was mad. Like she was like as she called herself, she was a black mother, lesbian warrior poet, black lesbian warrior poet. She was also a mother. But you know, these are difficult things to be in the United States in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even still, right? Like she was angry at the racism and the homophobia that she saw all around her, and that's a lot of the rest of this book deals with that as well. What else do I want to mention? So, okay. So we also know that this is an exploration of her identity as a lesbian. So on page 38, we kind of get this like like coded lesbian experience where she meets this little girl, Tony. And I just want to point out to you, like, the way she uses this language, that it is, like, incredibly erotic. So this is definitely meant to be something that we as readers take as, like, her first kind of understanding, or, like, inkling of understanding of her own sexuality, and of the way she feels about women. And Lorde, like, really loves women and sees, like, femininity as really, like, powerful. Like, there's a really famous picture of her that's, like, always on the internet, standing in front of a chalkboard on which she wrote, "Women are powerful and dangerous." And she saw her identity as a lesbian not just as, like, you know, like, she loved women, which she did, but she also saw it as, like, a political choice, like a political choice to remove herself entirely from the world of men and from the patriarchy, so that she could more organically create this community with, like, other women. So this is her sort of eroticized experience with this young girl, Tony. They're both little girls. This is on page 38. From around her neck hung a fluffy white fur muff that matched the white fur ball on the top of her hat. I touched her muff too, and then raised my hand up to feel the fur pom-pom. The soft, silky warmth of the fur made my fingers tingle in a way that the cold had not, and I pinched and fingered it until Tony finally shook her head free of my hand. And the rest of this section is, she uses similarly erotic language to kind of talk about this meeting with Tony. So I guess, I mean, I think we're all fairly, like, well aware of sort of, like, the political context of when she was writing, which would have been during, like, she was born in 1934, so, you know, she would have lived through, like, the civil rights movement in the United States, all this kind of political sort of agitation toward more racial equality in this country, and that obviously was important to her as a poet as well. So I want to share with you this poem from the Black Unicorn, or two poems from the Black Unicorn. So we'll start with this one. This is called Sister Outsider, which is also the title of her of a collection of essays that she wrote. We were born in a poor time, never touching each other's hunger, never sharing our crusts. In fear, the bread became enemy. Now we raise our children to respect themselves as well as each other. Now you have made loneliness holy and useful, and no longer needed. Now your light shines very brightly, but I want you to know your darkness also, rich and beyond fear. And this is called The Black Unicorn. The black unicorn is greedy. The black unicorn is impatient. The black unicorn was mistaken for a shadow or symbol and taken through a cold country where mist painted mockeries of my fury. It is not on her lap where the horn rests, but deep in her moon pit, growing. The black unicorn is restless. The black unicorn is unrelenting. The black unicorn is not free. So in a lot of her work, she's sort of working through sort of like the beauty and the power of what it means to be a black woman. And I would just, totally like recommend that you read more of it, because we don't have as much time as I would like to in this class. But I hope this will have been helpful for you, and I will also be checking your answers to the discussion questions and responding to those, because as I said, I think this book is a lot more, I don't know, it's like it's worth discussing, but like I don't know what to just tell you about it, so yeah. So yeah, I'll talk to you guys in the discussion. For next week, we're gonna read Nevada. I guess like the first half of it. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you guys are all doing well and staying safe.